Thanks for listening to the Neoliberal Podcast. Today's episode is on food trucks, and if you want to support the podcast, you can go to our website, neoliberalproject.org/store, where we have many food truck-themed t-shirts, stickers, and more. Buy some merchandise, show off your neoliberal swag, and support the podcast. That's neoliberalproject.org/store. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Progressive Policy Institute. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson. Joining us today is Kyle Sweetland. He's a researcher at the Institute for Justice and one of the authors of a new report titled Food Truck Truth: Why Restaurants and Cities Have Nothing to Fear from the Mobile Food Business. And that's the topic of today's episode. Food trucks, the mobile food industry, how cities and states are regulating food trucks, and whether or not it makes any sense. So, Kyle, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jeremiah.
All right, so I guess to just start things off, I want to acknowledge that this is a very fun episode for us. You know, in any movement or any group ideology or anything like that, they've got their inside jokes, they've got their shared language and their memes. And I think one of our very first ever inside jokes as the neoliberal community was taco trucks on every corner. Mm-hmm. This was obviously from the 2016 election. Some guy gets up and says, you know, if we elect Hillary Clinton, we're going to have taco trucks on every corner. And, you know, a bunch of us said, that sounds fantastic. Let's check out this Hillary lady. And I don't know, it would be wrong to start the episode with at least acknowledging that. When you started working on this issue, were you aware of kind of the jokes that people make about this?
Yeah, actually, I had heard of some of these jokes before. And so it's always interesting to see how people talk about food trucks and what their perceptions are of them.
What do you normally run into when you talk to everyday people about this?
Yeah, most people that I run into are very interested in food trucks. They think that they're a great idea. They love the food that they can get. Usually they talk about how inexpensive it is to purchase food from food trucks, and they just like being able to support someone who lives and works in their local community and who is interested in becoming a restaurant owner one day themselves.
So before we get into the details, because we're going to dive in, but before we do that, can you tell me just how you got started working in this area? Because I know that the Institute for Justice, this is not the first thing that you guys have done in the food industry, the restaurant industry, with kind of the mobile food industry. You guys have been working in this for a little while. So before we get into the details of the study and we start talking economics, just how did you end up here?
Yeah, so the way we have really gone about working with food truck owners is as a result of the popularity of food trucks. And in recent years, food trucks have become very popular, but as a result of their popularity, a lot of cities haven't really appreciated the competition they bring to restaurants. And so seeing these sort of anti-competitive claims that cities bring against food trucks and a desire to squash the little guy has really created this opportunity for us to defend people's right to be able to run their own business and to also show that restaurants don't have anything to fear from these mobile food businesses.
And the Institute for Justice, just to talk about the organization for a little bit, it's kind of an interesting setup where it seems like you guys do kind of the traditional think tank work. You put out white papers, you do analysis, you know, you do policy advocacy, the typical think tank portfolio, but you also do some level of legal representation, right? And like legal assistance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we do help out lots of people with not only our research, which describes some of the issues that people go through in a broader sense, but we also take on individual cases for people who have been harmed in these ways that we identify with our reports and our research. And so we are, if I could best describe our department, we work with data to help prove the points of our litigation and the cases that we bring to the courts. And so in that way, we help not only inform the general public about things like food trucks, but also have an opportunity to support the work we do in the court system.
All right, so let's dive into this report. I want to talk about something that I found really charming at the very beginning of the report, which is the history of food trucks. Can you talk a little bit about just how far this goes back? Like, you know, these are not necessarily a new phenomenon, even though they've become very, very popular very recently.
Yeah. So food trucks, really, it seems like they are a recent phenomenon, given how much more popular they've become since the Great Recession in 2008. But they have been around for decades, well before this time. And so you really find the genesis of street vending, of food, back in public markets in the late 19th century. But then you see coming into the 20th century, street vending became even more popular because it provided legitimate work for a growing immigrant population. And similar to today, you see a lot of private businesses and municipalities not being so adamant towards food trucks and in this case, street vendors who sold food on the streets, because they saw that these business owners were oftentimes just not creating the environment that the city wanted, and so they resented that competition as well, many of the brick and mortar businesses. And as a result, cities tried to push out street vending in the early 20th century, similar to what they're trying to do today.
Isn't it interesting, by the way, just that these have always been associated with an immigrant population, you know, way back in the 1800s, perhaps, and certainly today?
Yeah, for sure. And back then, they called it the pushcart evil. As a way of trying to as a way of trying to squash this sort of competition that they just didn't like. And as a result, that pushed a lot of these street vendors out from the main streets of cities and into other areas where they could operate more freely, like construction sites. So during the 1960s, when there was a building boom, a lot of vendors finding few other places in cities to work would bring their food to blue-collar workers who had few lunch alternatives on these construction sites. But with that change in scenery came a change in their reputation, and unfortunately not one that was good. So with the little competition that vendors had in these areas, their standards kind of slipped, and they became, unfortunately, known as roach coaches because of how unsanitary they were. And so this reputation was something that food trucks languished under up until the Great Recession in 2008, and that changed the industry dramatically to what we see today.
I just got to say, if a politician today stood up and said, we've got to combat the pushcart evil, that would actually be extremely funny. But let's talk about the explosion in popularity, because when I was growing up in late 90s, early 2000s, food trucks were generally not a thing. Maybe there were a couple, but people didn't really think about them, know they existed very much. How did food trucks become so popular so quickly? Because it seems like out of nowhere, everybody's talking about food trucks now.
Yeah. So one big reason why food trucks became popular is during the Great Recession, a lot of people working in the restaurant industry were left unemployed and looking for ways to support themselves. They saw entering the food service industry themselves as an opportunity. But unfortunately, with the recession and obviously having a harder time to get the the financing for opening a brick and mortar restaurant, a lot of these people saw food trucks as the opportunity, since they're so much less expensive to start and run than a brick and mortar building, a restaurant. So when workers were laid off, this was the opportunity they saw. And so a lot of people who were entering this saw food trucks as languishing under this sort of bad reputation, but there was this opportunity in their minds that food trucks could be a way to provide affordable, high-quality food. And so you start to see certain food trucks coming out that are very popular today, like Kogi, which is a Mexican and Korean barbecue food truck popular in California. And you see a lot of other food trucks like that have come out of that era of people looking for that opportunity. Another thing is that made food trucks so popular is how mobile they were. And with the ability to broadcast where your business was operating with Twitter, saying we are at this location, that allowed these food trucks to get more of a following using the social media. And as a result of being mobile, they could go to the places where people were. They didn't have to wait for people to come to them.
Yeah, it's funny. When I think about food trucks, I often think about the movie Chef, which I think came out in 2013 or 2014. But it's probably, I don't know, I think of that as like a tipping point for food truck popularity. If this started during the Great Recession, 2009, 2008, and by 2020, it's like already, it's established. It's a very popular thing. People know it exists. I think of Chef as like the midpoint of that, where it entered really the public consciousness. But even in Chef, you have this guy who's social media is a big part of that movie. I think he has like his daughter help him like post where he's going on like the internet. And like back in 2014, it was still a thing to be like, haha, the internet, in a movie. But I don't know. It's interesting to have watched that growth. What can we say about the level that food trucks are at right now? Like what portion of the restaurant industry are they? Because I'd imagine, even as we talk about how much they've grown, this is still a very small thing, I'd imagine, compared to the entire restaurant industry.
Yeah. So it still is a small part of the overall restaurant industry. When we were doing our study, we noticed that in an average county, you have 145 restaurants and just one food truck. So that gives you an idea of how much food trucks are a dwarf in comparison to the behemoth of the restaurant industry overall. But an interesting thing to note is that the food truck industry has been one of the fastest growing segments of the overall restaurant industry. And so it's certainly something that's here to stay, but it's also something that's growing in a very significant way, and has continued to grow during the recession as well, in the coronavirus pandemic.
All right, so you and I both seem very excited about this. I'm putting my cards on the table. I love food trucks. People listening to this podcast probably know that. They probably guessed. It probably wasn't very hard to figure that out. You're obviously kind of slanted here. You're biased. We're both biased. It's fine. We acknowledge the bias. But there are some people out there who are not happy with this, and they want to regulate food trucks. They want to stop them from operating. What can you tell me about the efforts to regulate food trucks? What is the reasoning here? What are people doing? What are the actions that people are taking? What level of government is this being done at? Just what's the landscape look like? You have a whole section in the report called The War on Food Trucks, which everything is a war these days. So walk me through what's going on here. Yeah.
So, of course, with anything that becomes popular, you're going to find someone at the party who isn't happy about it. And in this case, the people who aren't happy about food trucks and their popularity since the Great Recession have been restaurants and their allies, which are usually the lobbyists in the restaurant industry. And they've alleged that food trucks are harming restaurants primarily because They're mobile, so they can move to where customers are while restaurants can't. They have much lower starting costs and lower operating costs than a traditional restaurant. As a result, they represent unfair competition. They also don't supposedly have to pay the same level of taxes and fees to local governments to be able to operate on property. And so restaurants allege that food trucks are harming these restaurants, threatening to put them out of business, taking away their customers. And this is the sort of problem that cities have thought that they need to solve. And they've gone about it in a variety of different ways. Sometimes cities restrict food trucks by limiting the number of food trucks that can operate in their city. Sometimes municipalities will restrict how long a food truck can operate in any one spot in the city, or they can restrict whether or not they're allowed to operate within a certain number of feet of a restaurant. So these things can push food trucks out of cities and inherently are meant to protect restaurants from the supposed harm that food trucks bring to restaurants. But our study definitely shows that to not be the case.
So I want to get into the empirical study in a second, because this is based on some data that Institute for Justice has been able to find. But before we get deep into the numbers, I want to talk about just some theoretical objections that people might have. I'm going to try my best to play devil's advocate, even though I'm pretty clearly on one side of this issue. I'm going to take that burden, and somebody's got to raise objections, or it's just going to be two guys agreeing with each other for the whole podcast. And who wants to hear that, right? So one of the things that I can imagine someone saying is, I'm a local government. I've structured my ability to get revenue, which we need to operate all sorts of important things. We need this. If you want the trash taken out, if you want your local libraries funded, and blah, 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 then we've got to collect our tax revenue. And I've structured my government around these property taxes. And restaurants are paying them. Restaurants pay us the right kind of fees. They pay property taxes, and food trucks do not. And so therefore, I should be biased in favor of the restaurants. How would you respond to something like that?
I suppose that would make sense if it were really true that food trucks took away revenue from your businesses and were generally a blight to the downtown community. But as time has shown, restaurants and food trucks actually complement each other in a very nice way. And it turns out that a lot of these food trucks will bring additional customers to restaurants and other businesses in downtown areas. So the idea that these food trucks, threaten to put restaurants out of business and reduce our tax base, certainly are misfounded based on what we know. But assuming, that there is some sort of harm that is done, a lot of food trucks end up wanting to be restaurant owners themselves someday. They don't want to stay in a food truck the rest of their lives. So
yeah, it's pretty cramped in there, honestly.
Yeah,
very small space.
The very argument that they put restaurants out of business doesn't mean that space won't one day be occupied by a restaurant that a food truck created. And it turns out that even though they may not pay the same level of taxes, food trucks are still bringing in revenue for the city, especially in terms of their sales taxes and obviously the other revenue that they bring for businesses that are attracted to their presence.
Yeah, even as I was formulating that question and asking it, I was kind of coming up with my own rebuttal in my head. Maybe I'm not a very good devil's advocate, but one of the things I was thinking was that even if you grant that food trucks cause restaurants to close, that doesn't mean the space is necessarily going to sit empty. Food trucks are a great gathering spot, and they attract pedestrians, and maybe a clothing store will come in there, or something else, some other form of retail that would then also be paying property tax,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe the government can just reform how they get their revenue to change with the times. That's also a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
But another devil's advocate argument would be a health and safety argument where, people will say, look, it's just inherently harder to keep a clean and safe kitchen with a food truck. It's harder to keep frozen things frozen. The refrigerators are not as strong. It's hard to keep, warm foods that need to be kept at 140 degrees. It's harder to keep those warm. It's more likely to get dirty. You might be prepping things off-site in a kitchen that nobody can see, that maybe that kitchen is really dirty and nobody can even monitor that. Do you think that there are legitimate health and safety reasons for extra regulations for food trucks?
Of course, no one would argue against the claim that food trucks and restaurants both need to have standards that protect the public health and safety. To the extent that food trucks do have regulations on protecting public health and safety, they shouldn't be any more restrictive than those that are applied to your brick and mortar restaurant. Doesn't mean that they'll be the exact same standards, but the fact of the matter is that they shouldn't have to meet a standard that is higher and above what restaurants have to meet. We actually did a very interesting study on this argument in a report that we published back in 2014 called Street Eats, Safe Eats. And what that report studied was how safe are food trucks in comparison to restaurants. We looked at 7 cities in America, and the study found that food trucks and food carts did just as well, if not better, than restaurants on their safety inspections. And as a result, this notion that the food you get from a food truck is less safe than what you would get from a restaurant is a myth. And so, but to the extent that cities do feel they need to regulate food trucks in a particular way, that shouldn't be in a way that is seeking to do anything else other than protecting the public health and the safety.
All right, so the last kind of devil's advocate argument that I can think of comes from a restaurant owner directly. And the restaurant owner basically is just appealing to common sense. They've bought a physical establishment, a physical building. They're set up in that building. And, they pay property taxes for this. They've invested a lot of money in this. And for somebody to just come park directly in front of their building and try to steal their customers, there's a common sense aspect that just feels very unfair, and people do this all the time. There's sometimes you can't, without laying out some kind of formal ethical framework, you just point at something and say, that's bullshit, Everybody can tell that's bullshit, and it's totally unfair. And the restaurant owner is probably going to deeply feel that I've paid for this, I've set up my business, it's all done properly, and this guy just wants to come park his truck 20 feet from my entrance or 30 feet from my entrance, and it's going to take all my customers. How is that fair? How would you respond to a restaurant owner making this kind of appeal?
Yeah, certainly I appreciate that point. Many food trucks are not actually direct competitors with restaurants. So keeping that in mind, traditionally they've competed with other restaurants that are not your traditional full service restaurant, but instead your fast food restaurants. And if they make a better product than you do as a brick and mortar restaurant, and people are going to them instead of to you, that's just a matter of competition. And certainly some restaurants may close due to competition from food trucks. All the time this may happen, but that competition from food trucks is no different than, say, competition from a restaurant that may be across the street from you, that may bring other traffic and customers from your store to theirs. And no one would argue that government should be in the business of picking winners and losers in such a case. The restaurants don't own the customers, and so they don't need or deserve any special protection from food trucks when they choose to compete.
Okay, that's actually interesting because the resistance from restaurants, I want to dive into that. And then it'll be kind of my last theory question before we really get into the numbers. If we divide this into kind of theoretical questions and then like let's talk about the data. But I'm interested in the resistance because this is not an isolated incident. You see this kind of resistance in many, many places all around the country. You guys have documented this. Cities all over the country. Some are friendlier than others, but resistance pops up in a lot of places. And I have two theories in my mind about why this is happening. Number one is kind of a generalized NIMBYism. That, the NIMBY movement is a movement that tries to stop people from building housing or anything else near them, not in my backyard. And at this podcast and this movement, we're big on housing. We're YIMBYs. We like to build things. But the NIMBYs are a big problem. And a lot of times that gets generalized to other stuff. We don't just want to build housing. The NIMBYs are trying to block a solar power project, or they're trying to block a hydroelectric dam, or they're trying to block whatever. So theory number one for me is just this is generalized NIMBYism. We don't want new things. We don't want you changing our community. We like it the way it is, blah, blah, blah. Theory number two is that this is a more concentrated thing and that this is restaurant owners as a lobby group trying to basically protect themselves from competition. It's almost, you could imagine it as cartel behavior, that we have this slice of business. We don't want to compete with anyone else. We're going to use our power as a big organization to influence politicians and get them to make our competition illegal. Which of those two theories do you believe is kind of a more accurate description of why this resistance to food trucks is taking place?
I believe it's the latter of those two, Jeremiah. When you look at what is being said in the news and the media about the reasons for restaurants not wanting food trucks around, most of it has to do with their revenue. For example, back when we were coming out of the Great Recession, a lot of the larger cities like San Francisco and Chicago and LA were complaining about food trucks. And one executive director of a restaurant association said that restaurants saw daily revenue loss of up to 30 to 40% when food trucks park outside their business, allegedly. And then today, what you see in smaller towns and cities across America, who are now the frontier of resistance to food trucks, many of them are complaining that the competition from the food trucks would harm their revenue. For example, in Ottawa, Illinois, restaurants asked the city council to regulate food trucks due to the pandemic's impact on their business, stating that the last thing they need is food trucks sitting at their front door. So the argument that most of the time we see is that restaurants just don't want the competition. They don't want somebody allegedly taking their revenue from them. And oftentimes you see these arguments coming up when restaurants are hurting the most, such as during a recession.
All right, so let's jump into the data. We've been talking about theory for a while. We've been talking about these general arguments. But can you describe what you actually did to try to measure this? Because this is a testable theory. The whole idea that food trucks are really bad for restaurants, that's something we theoretically can test. We can try to gather some evidence and see if it's true or not. How did you guys go about that?
Yeah, so the way we went about studying this study is we asked the question, do food trucks cause restaurants to go out of business? And the way we measured that was looking at counts of the number of restaurants and food trucks at the county level for 12 years, more specifically from 2005 to 2016, to see if the number of food trucks present in a county in one year led to fewer restaurants in the next year. And our study shows that, in fact, that doesn't really hold true. We don't see a decline in the number of restaurants in a subsequent year where we see growth in food trucks in the prior year. So this claim that food trucks put restaurants out of business is misfounded based on the data that we see across the entire country.
One of the trickiest things to do when you're doing a study like this is to figure out how to move from correlation to causation. You know, it seems like the amount of food trucks in year 0 is not correlated with a decrease in restaurants in year 1, the next year. But it's always tricky to prove that, you know, that there's no causation there, that there's not some third factor causing everything. What did you guys do as kind of an empirical team to address that?
Yeah, so obviously we knew, this time period we were covering the recession. And so one of the things that we wanted to control for to make sure that, we aren't just identifying some sort of correlation and there's some sort of third factor at play here that's explaining the lack of a relationship or lack of restaurant closures as a result of new food trucks coming in. So we controlled for other things related to the economy. We controlled for population and the unemployment rate in a county over this time period. And we also controlled for the diversity of the county based on the different ethnicities that we see.
That's an interesting one. Why would you control for ethnicity?
Yeah, so we saw this ethnic diversity as being an indicator from the literature that we reviewed, indicating the presence of food trucks. So that was the reason why we decided to include that one in there specifically.
And what is the general background of the industry that we're working with? Like, we've obviously talked about that during this time period that you're studying, about a decade, food trucks are growing tremendously. But what is the general restaurant industry doing during this time? Did they stagnate? Did they decline? Did they increase?
Yeah, so it's interesting you asked that because when you just simply look at the correlation between the two, the restaurant growth and food truck growth, both are growing. Food trucks are growing a little bit more quickly than restaurants are, but they're also much smaller. So for every additional food truck that you would see in a county, you would expect to see 3 additional restaurants. That's what the data tell us over time. But again, the sheer difference in size that I mentioned earlier is still present in these counties. And so oftentimes you're seeing fewer than 2 food trucks. Maybe over the time period it grew from 1 food truck to 2 food trucks in a county. But you're still seeing restaurants going from 140 at the beginning of our time period to 180. So there's still growth in both the number of food trucks and the number of restaurants over this time period.
Yeah, I can see some kind of like real far out devil's advocate argument where, okay, but if we hadn't had the food trucks, then restaurant growth would have been even higher. But that it feels like you're having to really stretch at that point, without much evidence to support that. And especially, as you said, that food trucks are still less than 1% of the food for purchase, prepared food market, if you want to lump them in with the restaurants. It feels like that's there's no there. Restaurants have not been declining; they've been growing. Food trucks are still a tiny part of this market. I can't see a great argument, for arguing that they're harming food trucks, especially with the lack of correlation here.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to introduce the idea that what if we're wrong anyway? What if we missed something? There was an Excel error, and maybe food trucks do harm restaurants in the end. Even if that was the case, should I care? The libertarian inside of me kind of wants to know, like, well, I don't really care that for instance, the refrigerator is putting all the milkmen out of business. The creative destruction is a thing. The economy should be allowed to change and grow. And even if they are putting restaurants out of business, is that a problem? Should we care?
It's an interesting question. Let's assume, like you're saying, that they're really what we find is that food trucks do put restaurants out of business. They're upending the entire restaurant industry. Cities are losing these restaurants that provide the property taxes that they need. That's an interesting thought. Certainly, if we were to look at history and look at other examples of one industry upending another. Think about, back when the automobile was introduced, you had a lot of horse buggy makers who obviously were put out of business and harmed by the automobile being brought into existence. And so obviously, though, no one would think that was a bad thing.
Not just the buggy makers, but it's funny. New York used to have like 2 million horses.
Yeah. So you see these vast numbers of businesses that go under and people who are out of work. And it seems that an industry just completely disappears because it does. But it's replaced with something that ultimately is better. And if we were to see that food trucks were in fact replacing restaurants and putting them out of business, would we be able to say that that's a bad thing? I would think that history would tell us that's not a bad thing, but that's the free market at work. The government shouldn't be in the business of picking winners and losers, trying to protect restaurants from food trucks and the competition they bring. Obviously, we don't argue that some restaurants may be put out of business by food trucks, but as our study shows, that's not really the case, that restaurants are being put out of business by food trucks as a whole. What we are seeing, is that they actually share a complementary relationship. And as the pandemic has gone on, we see a large percentage of restaurants also running their own food trucks. A study that was done back in 2017, before the COVID-19 pandemic started, noted that 30 to 40% of all food trucks are restaurant affiliated, meaning they're associated with some brick and mortar restaurant. And so there are advantages that even the brick and mortar restaurants are recognizing about food trucks. And food trucks themselves, who started off, owners who started off operating a food truck, hope to one day run their own business. So there's a sort of complementary relationship that we've been able to identify. It doesn't, in fact, show this theoretical possibility of one industry, food trucks, replacing another, restaurants. But even if that were the case, Jeremiah, like I said, is that necessarily a bad thing? I would think that if we look back at history, that oftentimes the answer is no. It's a good thing.
I want to go back to horses for a second, because I want to make a correction, and then also I promise this is going to loop back around to the point that we're making. Okay. So I actually looked it up. It wasn't 2 million horses, but there were 100,000 horses living in New York in 1900. There was enough that there's like a Wikipedia article on the Great Horse Manure Crisis of 1894, where literally it was a problem because horses were, pardon my language, they were shitting in the streets so much that it was literally a public health problem. And that's how cities were back in the day, that the streets were mud and filth and horse manure, and horses were going around everywhere, and that's kind of how our urban areas were built. One of my favorite anecdotes about this is that American Express, the favorite credit card company you might have, is named American Express because they were a delivery service. And their original building, the famous American Express building in downtown Manhattan, was a stable for like thousands of horses. And that's the history of their company. That's why they're called American Express, is they were a horse delivery service. But I'm going to tie it back here. Super cool. Watch this. The way that you talked about how establishment businesses can take advantage of a new trend and prosper. Existing brick and mortar restaurants can take advantage of this and create their own food trucks, and many of them are. You said, like 30 to 40% of existing food trucks belong to a restaurant?
Yeah.
American Express saw this new fangled automobile trend, and they realized that, the whole idea of Pony Express, delivering mail quickly by a horse, was not going to work anymore. And so they pivoted. They pivoted to a new technology that was like interbank checking, and they started doing traveler's checks, and eventually they became a credit card company. They're a business that, rather than stick with the dying industry, they pivoted. And that reminds me of restaurants and food trucks. So there I've tried to take my very strange point and tie it all the way back.
Yeah. No, it's true though. I mean, restaurants, and people have noted this, that, the competition that food trucks have forced restaurants to innovate, to become more creative with the food they offer people, to compete. And it was at a time where restaurants really needed that competition to innovate. So if anything, it's really brought about a lot of good. And but clearly, it's also just something that is here to stay. Clearly, food trucks are not going anywhere. And restaurants are recognizing this, and they're embracing it. And so the claims of harm, of restaurants being shut down by the dozens in cities, by food trucks, and threatening to upend an entire industry, just aren't supported by the data that we look at.
All right, so my next question has 3 parts. Because you're a guy who's written a whole report on this. You work in this area. You think you know better than everybody. You know better than all these cities, right? So what should be done, I guess, is the real question. What should policy actually look like? And the way I'll phrase this is, I'd love to know, what's an example of a city that is getting this wrong, that has done the wrong things with regards to food trucks? What's an example of a city that's done it right, that has a very good set of policies? And what does an ideal set of policies look like? If you were the czar of food trucks, how would you build out your set of regulations and policies?
Yeah, certainly. The important thing to remember with all of this, and how cities have chosen to regulate food trucks in some of these ways that we talked about earlier, where food trucks are restricted from operating on private or public land, where they can't operate within a certain number of feet of another brick and mortar restaurant, or where they have to leave their location after being there a certain amount of time, don't have any basis in public health and safety, but in protecting restaurants from competition. And clearly, what our study has shown is that food trucks, instead of harming the restaurant industry, they complement it. So policy that is currently focusing on these anti-competitive restrictions should be repealed. And any sort of regulation that does exist on food trucks should be purely for protecting the public health and safety of residents and customers, not about protecting restaurants from food trucks. And to the extent that the rules of food trucks and restaurants are similar, they should be held to the same sort of standards as each other, meaning food trucks shouldn't have to meet a higher standard of cleanliness than a restaurant does. So anything that would be more than that would be anti-competitive and unnecessary. So from the theoretical overall ideal policy, that's what we would advocate for. But there are some good examples out there of cities who do things well. One good example I like to point to is Portland, Oregon, where they've created these gathering places for food trucks. And they allow food trucks to all be in one place, and they are a gathering place for people who are interested in eating at food trucks, and it brings about a lot of foot traffic to areas that may not be utilized as much in the city. And so they allow businesses in that part of the city to flourish. They make it a place that people want to go to, and they help, not only the small businesses, but also the city as well. So it's an example of recognizing the advantages of food trucks and how they can help a city grow economically. Some cities, though, really just don't want food trucks at all, and are doing a very poor job of encouraging them to come and operate in the city and bring all the benefits that they have to offer to people and to other businesses and to their local economies. So one example I like to point to is in Florida, Tarpon Springs, Florida, and they basically had an outright ban on food trucks, not allowing them to even come into the city at all, and that was ruled unconstitutional recently as a result of our efforts there. So there are certainly examples out there, even in recent times here, that show that some cities just are not even interested in allowing food trucks to operate in their cities. And it's obviously to their detriment, as our study would show. But there's certainly examples out there of cities and towns that just don't want anything to do with food trucks. And as a result, their policies are very focused on pushing them out or just banning them outright.
All right, so we're coming up on time here, and I'd love to ask our traditional final question that we always ask on this podcast, which is, where can people go to learn more? Now, I'm obviously going to start with the actual report, which is called Food Truck Truth. We're going to put a link to that in the show notes. If anybody wants to read it, you'll be able to see it in the show notes. It's a very readable, very easily digestible report. I would definitely recommend you take a look. But other than the report itself, Kyle, what would you recommend people check out? This could be somebody to follow on Twitter. It could be a book to read, another report that someone has put out, anything that someone who is interested in food trucks and their regulation and mobile food should learn about, should read.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, check out your local food trucks in your area. There are plenty of websites out there that will help you find where your food trucks are operating. Look for them on Twitter. Try and support, those food trucks that are out there, who are oftentimes minorities and entrepreneurs who are just trying to run a business. The other thing I would point people towards are other IJ research that we have done on food trucks. For example, Upwardly Mobile is one study we've done where we look at the street vendors across America and we talk about who they are. It helps you understand more about the people who are operating food trucks and how they are hardworking people who are often coming from disadvantaged economic groups, and you can better understand the kinds of people who are running these businesses. Another report I would point you all towards would be Street Eats, Safe Eats. I mentioned it earlier in the podcast here, and it studies 7 cities in America that show that food trucks and food carts are just as safe to eat at as restaurants. And so looking at this research would help debunk a claim that people who don't like food trucks make, which is that food trucks offer food that's not as safe to eat, and it's going to be a public health and safety concern. So I would recommend people check out both of those reports.
All right. Well, I always appreciate the work that the Institute for Justice does. And I especially appreciate any work that you guys do on food trucks. This is so directly up our alley that I am just incredibly pleased we could have you on the podcast. My guest today has been Kyle Sweetland. Kyle, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Jeremiah. I appreciate it so much.